we'll get started. And thank you so much for joining us today for our AMA for journalists on congressional casework. Real quick, I'll just provide a little bit of background. POPVOX Foundation, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we work to help democratic governments keep pace with rapid changes in technology and society. And aside from me, we're all former congressional staffers from both sides of the aisle. So we bring a certain amount of, love for the institution, but also empathy to our work to make government work better. And we're here to help you understand Congress, report on Congress, and get the perspective, being able to put yourself in the shoes of congressional staff to understand how the mechanisms of government really work on a human level. Today, we're focused on how Congress helps constituents through casework, which is a form of congressional oversight of the executive branch. And with people flooding Congress with requests for help because of changes happening right now in federal government services, casework is a really hot topic right now. And that's why we wanted to help inform your reporting and give you the guidebook and this training today so you can better understand how casework works. It reveals systemic federal government problems affecting your readers, but it also shows rare moments of really sweet bipartisan cooperation. Caseworkers are, you'll learn all about it from Anne, but I'll just say real quick, caseworkers are congressional staff back at the home districts, and they often become crucial mediators when government customer service fails. They also serve as a check on the executive branch. And casework actually helps districts economically by resolving benefit delays. And one of the things that we'll also cover is how casework helps you find and vet compelling human interest stories. So with that background, I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague, Anne Meeker, who is, I believe, employee number 2. When Marcy Harris, number 1, when Marcy Harris co-founded POPVOX Foundation in 2021. She's our deputy director, and Anne herself was a director of constituent services for a member of Congress. So she knows from firsthand experience what it's like handling all those phone calls from folks just desperate for help with things like their VA benefits, Social Security, getting their passport renewed. And I particularly love how Anne frames casework as one of those places where public servants get to tell the people back home, hang on, I'm going to help you. And then I go talk to the federal agency the person's having the issue with, I get it resolved, I come back to the constituent, and I'm able to give them good news. So as a comms director in government reform, I'm so happy when we can always say, how often can we give good news about Congress? Anne created the Journalist Guide to Casework with you in mind. And she also, if you don't know, recently started a Substack based on her experiences and also just her immense knowledge of the future of civic engagement. And it's called Voice/Mail. And you can subscribe to it at voicemailgov.substack.com. I think I covered it all. Without further ado, let's get into it. Anne, are you ready?
Absolutely. Thank you for the kind introduction, Gab.
Of course, of course. So let's start with the big picture. Why do member offices do casework? Is it really just a way to get reelected?
Yeah, sure. So something I've really talked about recently in that Substack that you mentioned is a lot of times member offices do some of their work on constituent engagement because there's no one else to do it. But casework is really unique because it is part of Congress's fundamental Article 1 responsibility. It involves the First Amendment right of constituents to petition for redress to their government. So a lot of constituents are saying, hey, I have a problem, and my member of Congress, hey, I'm talking to you. Come help me. This is important. And then it also gets in, as you mentioned, to Congress's oversight over the executive branch agencies. So casework is a really important way that members of Congress learn about how the laws they pass are being implemented and where the problems are, where the edge cases are, where the weird cases where we may not have thought about them as we're writing that legislation come into play and really impact constituents. And then, as we said, it's also an opportunity to just provide some really tangible benefits for constituents and do that important person-to-person work of making people feel heard and truly represented. There was a report from the former members of Congress Association a few years ago in the pandemic that asked former members, hey, what do you remember from your time in office? And all of them said constituent services. as no matter what big pieces of legislation they were able to pass, that was the thing where they felt like the job was worth it, where they got something done, where they left an impact behind.
Nice. I love that. Um, so how do member offices get answers when folks ask them like, hey, can you help me with getting my password renewed or something like that? Can you walk me through the process of casework?
Yeah, sure. And I will say one of the fun things about casework is that it does vary from office to office. So each individual member office is responsible for doing their own casework, setting their own process. So sometimes it'll vary a little bit, but in kind of the big picture, 10,000-foot view, casework goes like this. Constituent has a problem. They learn that they can talk to their member of Congress. They call that member. When they talk to that intern or whoever on the phone, that gets diverted to the casework team. So that intern gets trained to hear like, oh, this is a problem, like an individual problem, not an opinion on policy. So I should send that to the casework team. Casework team does an intake process where they talk to that constituent. They do a really in-depth interview and process to say, hey, what's going on here? What is your goal? What is your ask? What's the agency you've been in touch with? What's happened so far? Do you have documentation? The constituent signs a Privacy Act release form that lets the member get information from the agency at hand. And then the caseworker goes to the congressional liaison at the correct agency. And that's really where members are effective, that there is a specific person at the agency who is designated to answer congressional requests for constituent services work. So then that cycle kind of continues for a little bit. The member office talks to the liaison. They might need to go back to the constituent to clarify something, have a constituent take a next step, and really kind of work that cycle until we come to some kind of resolution. A lot of times it is good news. Members of Congress can be very effective on behalf of their constituents, although there are some limitations that we talk about in the guide that we can get to later if that's helpful. Sometimes it's not good news. Sometimes the answer is just the law was appropriately followed here. And again, that's where casework really identifies places where we followed the law correctly, but there's a problem with the law. And so sometimes that'll get escalated up to the policy team too.
Fascinating. I'm happy to know like it can go either way. Yeah, what about has casework always been a thing? Has Congress always conducted casework? Is it doing more? Is it doing less now under the new administration? Do you know that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And a couple things I'm definitely going to refer you to for some further reading, further insight here than I have here. That specific just relationship between constituent and their member of, hey, I need you to do something. I need something from the government. I'm having a problem that I need you to resolve for me personally, has always been a feature of our government. So we have some of these historical letters from folks you'll recognize from the founding fathers, kind of talking back and forth with constituents about like their pensions from fighting in the Revolutionary War. So that's always been a feature of representation in the US. It has really changed. And I will say one of our Casework Navigator webinars that is still my absolute favorite was when we brought Associate Senate historian Daniel Holt in to talk through the history of casework. And I really recommend taking a look through that. He really traces how it has evolved. Today, casework is a little bit more restricted than it has been in previous decades. Private bills are less of a thing. You might still hear of them occasionally. It's when Congress passes a bill intended to kind of lift the law for a specific constituent. They are almost unheard of now. They used to be the main way casework was conducted. But today, members of Congress can essentially not ask an agency to break a law on behalf of a constituent, but they can weigh in to make sure that the law was followed properly. So that's really kind of the essential function of casework today. And as far as doing more or less of it under the Trump administration, part of the problem in answering your question is that we don't have good data right now on how many cases do members of Congress work. So as I mentioned up top, each individual member of Congress runs their own casework operation. They personally own the data that comes into them as casework. And right now, that's changing. I'm really excited about how it's changing. There is no way that members of Congress share that data amongst each other. You might get two members saying, hey, I'm hearing, a huge rise in VA cases right now. Are you seeing the same thing? And there's definitely coordination on the staff level, but there's no way to see that across all members of Congress. Anecdotally, we are hearing, yes, there is a huge amount of new casework that's coming in with rapid changes in the executive branch right now.
Wow. Okay. So I'm learning something here, and I thought I learned this from working with you in the last year or so.
Maybe
Casework
talking
goes
with
back
you
to the
about.
founders. I know. Wait, I'm sorry. I have to paint this picture. Whenever there's a topic that we're just little side tangent for a sec for the audience here. Whenever we're talking like in a staff meeting or whatnot, and it might not be about casework, at least not ostensibly. Anne's like, haha.
I'm gonna make it about casework.
What do you say? You're like the Kool-Aid
I am the
guy
Kool-Aid
comes
man for casework.
crashing through the wall. It's about casework. So it
So
goes back
really,
to the
I'm gonna,
founders.
can I tangent on your tangent though?
Please.
Genuinely though, I think I get so excited about casework, not just because I did it and I talk to caseworkers and they're the coolest people in Congress, but it is just this crazy underappreciated, underknown, underutilized section of what Congress does. Our very back of the envelope math says that caseworkers are about 20% of congressional staff, which is just a huge proportion of how many people work for Congress and a huge proportion of the time that members spend talking to their constituents. So it's always wild to me that it's just not better known, it's not better understood, which is part of why we wanted to do this today. And we're so delighted that y'all are joining us to talk about it.
Appreciate that. Appreciate you. So, like I was saying before, I'm amazed. Casework goes back to the founders. You described such an evolution from like writing private laws, although apparently that might still happen. But you also mentioned data. So let's dig into a little bit about that. If member offices are learning so much about programs and policies through casework, when they learn that, where does that information go? Does that eventually become legislation? Does it become public policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, when member office, so for most offices, there's a deep connection between their district and their DC team. So you have your district-based folks who are talking about casework, and then your DC-based team who's responsible for your policy and oversight. So especially in really every office will have a little bit of back and forth there. They're all the same team, they're all under the same member, they're all oriented around the same mission, the same goals. But in really, really good teams, what I see when I'm talking to offices in our Casework Navigator program is an active cycle between these two offices. So where the casework team is saying, hey, we have a really good handle on our internal data. And, for example, hey, we've just got this wave of aid and attendance cases with the VA that don't seem to have a resolution, or it seems like there's a process problem here. Talking to the VA ledge staffer, hey, what can we do to fix this? Can we write an oversight letter? Can we sign on to a bill? Should we consider writing a bill? So obviously how each member can kind of be really effective on addressing those casework issues depends on the same factors that impact how individual members can be effective on any kind of legislation. What's their committee? Are they in the majority and minority? Are they super senior? Just what's possible there. But yes, we do definitely see casework driving some of the policy agenda, some of that oversight agenda to actually change what members are seeing through casework.
That's great. I've come to think of casework as like the canary in the coal mine. It's a signal like, warning, something's happening here that needs your attention. Do you want to comment any more on that?
Yeah, totally. And that's really been my experience as well, that sometimes when we see these like giant stories in the news about the federal government, when you talk to caseworkers, they saw those months ago. They saw those show up months ago. So the pandemic and the pandemic era programs is a really good example here. So there's been one program for the IRS that's been especially problematic. It's the Employee Retention Tax Credit. It was a new program instituted in the pandemic that's really had a lot of fraud and also had a lot of just administrative difficulty with how the IRS administers that program. That first showed up before it hit the news in casework, with employers going to members of Congress to say, hey, I'm supposed to get this credit. I can't tell where it is. The IRS process is really opaque. Can you help me? So I think, like you said up top, I think talking to offices about what they're seeing in casework is always a really great way to get us finger on the pulse for just what's happening with how constituents interact with their government.
So journalists take note. It's a scoop machine for you. Start developing those relationships with caseworkers, follow casework, and you'll be able to break the story that the rest of us or the rest of most folks will know like down the line. Any memorable cases come to mind, either about that or just more generally, Anne?
Oh my gosh, yes. And I will say, so just my background as a caseworker, so I cycled through a couple of different policy portfolios before I took over as director in the office that I worked for. So I've handled every area of casework except immigration. Talked to a lot of immigration caseworkers. I know the basics over there, but my portfolio was Social Security, Medicare, IRS, USPS, the VA, DoD. So that's kind of my area. One case that I think is a really good example of how a team can be effective, kind of under the radar, was we had it was such a heartbreaking case. We had a family come in where it was for the spouse of a World War II veteran, and she was eligible for this benefit called aid and attendance. That's if a combat veteran or their spouse is not able to take care of themselves, the VA will pay for their assisted living, their nursing home, their skilled nursing, whatever. but the application process was taking years. And so you'd have veterans passing away while they were waiting for this benefit, and their family is paying for that nursing facility in the meantime. If they don't get the benefit before the veteran passes, they're on the hook. So we had this family come in and say, hey, we applied and we haven't heard anything. And I talked to the VA and they said, we never got an application from them. So what we found out was the VA was actually in the process of modernizing their website. But in the meantime, they had two separate websites with two separate sets of instructions on how to apply. The veteran followed one set of instructions that wasn't the current one, and so their application wasn't accepted. So that was a moment where we were able to say, hey, we found this out through casework. VA, can you make sure to please change this website? And they did. So it didn't take an act of legislation. It just took really good casework. It took a lot of sleuthing, a lot of talking to that constituent, and then just a strong relationship of trust between that office and the VA to say, hey, we've identified something. Can you fix it? And we don't know how many veterans that might have helped going forward, but that's kind of one of those little impacts that I keep close to me for this is what casework can do.
That's amazing. And I'm sure also speaks to the ability for folks to put aside party differences and work together for the greater good. You said casework is bipartisan. Can you explain a little bit more how that works, especially in a time like now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always tell people like casework is one of those weird little under the radar moments where we always hear about how Congress is so overly partisan, it's so polarized, no one can do anything together. Um, but caseworkers genuinely are almost nonpartisan staff when they're doing their work. They take so much pride in they really don't want to know who you voted for when you call an office and you're asking for casework. They're going to help you no matter what. And the other cool thing, so in the last year, we've done a lot of research for our team at POPVOX Foundation on how does casework work in disasters and in crises. So in the worst possible moments, what happens? What does that look like from a casework perspective, a constituent perspective reflected through casework? Um, and one of the things we've really found that I think is really exciting is watching caseworkers self-organize into these giant chamber networks. So basically, caseworkers from all parties, both sides of the aisle, are on these giant Teams chats trying to share information on what's happening. So in the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, this was a big moment where no one could figure out what was happening. They're getting all these desperate calls, people trying to leave, American citizens leaving, visa holders leaving. And so they got on this giant Teams chat to just share what was happening. So you had this real-time, crowdsourced, bipartisan understanding of the situation on the ground, X thousand miles away, in a combat zone. So that's just the moment where like bipartisanship happens and bipartisan information sharing happens, bipartisan cooperation, collaboration to serve constituents, no matter who they voted for, where they are, happens. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, that gives me all the feels. I mean, that's America at our greatest. That's democracy in action, right? And that's helping people with quality of life. Um, and speaking of quality of life, casework, you've mentioned casework can bring money back to districts. Sometimes members have brought millions of dollars back home because of their casework. What's going on there? How do they count their money? Like how this bring some transparency to that,
What
please,
is
Anne.
this? Totally. And I will say just so for reporters, you're often probably going to get these emails, these pitches from members at the end of the year when they do like an end of year report. And you will see that line like, we brought back X million dollars to our district through casework. So what's happening there is a lot of times what's at stake in casework is retroactive benefits. Retroactive benefits or kind of payouts that should have already happened, but for some reason they're hung up in a bureaucratic delay. And so what members are trying to do is not say, hey, agency, you should pay this constituent, but say, hey, agency, you've already said you owe this constituent this money. Where is it? So for an example, I had a Social Security case at one point that was for a disability appeal. So this woman had appealed her disability. She was deemed not eligible for disability. She appealed it and then she won the appeal. It was like a $30,000 retroactive check because she'd been waiting that long for the period of the appeal. And then there was a snafu over where the check was sent that we were able to sort that out. But that's the kind of thing that I would have entered into my system as she was owed that $30,000 and it would not have come to her unless we had intervened. So again, every team is going to count this a little bit differently. And this is something where we've issued some guidance recommendations for offices on how to kind of count this. But if you're talking to an office for their end of year report, it's worth asking some questions about, hey, what do you include there? Are you including just casework? Are you including just those big retro checks? Are you including things like delayed tax refunds? Are you including things like projected future benefits? My team didn't do that. Some teams do. So again, it's a little bit different for how each office calculates it. Obviously, every office wants to put up the biggest number it can. But that is genuinely an area where members bring back a surprising amount of money that their constituents were already owed.
That's amazing. I'm all for fiscal responsibility, bringing the money back. So you've written, and we've been reading about just a huge uptick in calls to Congress, people asking for help. Some of those folks might be federal employees just asking for help as well. And so as a constituent, if I'm calling my member of Congress for casework help, like, what do I need to know before reaching out? Can I contact any member? What if I didn't vote for the person who's representing my district? Like, can I still ask them for help? Do I just go to one chamber? Do I go to the House, Senate? Yeah, a little bit more about like the getting into the nuts and bolts. If I'm a constituent, what do I do?
Yeah, totally. Maybe a couple things. So first of all, yes, you have to be a constituent of that member. So calling someone a couple states away is not going to work. It has to be the member that represents you first and foremost. So that is your House member and then your 2 senators. All of them will have a casework team, but again, because casework is at the discretion of the member, some members might emphasize it a little bit differently than others. But yes, you can talk to your House member, both senators, all of them should be able to help you. It does not matter if you voted for them. In fact, our team is really, really cautious about using the word constituent instead of voter or citizen, because a constituent is everybody who that member represents. That is citizens and non-citizens. So members do a lot of work, of immigration work for people who may be visa holders or non-citizens or trying to become citizens. But that's really important, that you don't have to be a citizen. You don't have to be a voter. As I said, most casework teams don't want to know if you're a voter. That doesn't help them. This is very separate. It's an official side activity. It's not a campaign side activity. So this is the money that that member receives to do the job they were elected to do, which is help you when you need help. If you do not like the service you're getting from one of your members, you can always try the other chamber. Definitely had folks do that. I would always recommend just being transparent in your communication, saying, hey, I'm going to talk to the Senate about this. If I'm unhappy with the House, just to everyone who's working on your behalf is kind of on the same page. Yeah, I think that's be aware that they're going to ask for any documentation that you've gotten from your case already. They are going to ask you to sign a Privacy Act release form. As we said, that's the thing that tells agencies that that member has your permission to disclose information to that member of Congress. And then just come in with realistic expectations. Again, members can do a lot. They can be extraordinarily effective, but they are limited by some ethics rules. They are limited by some legal rules. As we said, they can't ask for an exception to the law for you. What they can do is make sure that the law has been properly followed in your case. And sometimes that takes a while too. I wish members of Congress had a magic wand, but agencies, keep in mind that those agency staff we talked about, the liaisons, are answering questions from every member of Congress. You might have, a team of just a couple of people who are responsible for 541 possible inquiries at any given time. So just have some grace with your congressional team. Just explain to them if something's really urgent. They will always try to escalate a case, move a case faster if there is really important, like if it's eviction, foreclosure, if your health insurance is getting cut off for an important procedure. But for everything else, again, just trusting your team. If they say it's going to take 30 days, it probably will.
That's such good advice for folks to just get their ducks in a row so that they can be as prepared as possible when they're going to the member asking for help. And so how do I know as a constituent, I've done all that. I have a file, like someone's helping me from my district office. How do I know if they're doing a good job? Are there things to look for? And so if I'm also wearing my reporter's hat, how do I know if the caseworker is doing a good job in this situation?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Definitely your team should be communicative. And again, keeping your expectations manageable. If you know that your team is getting hundreds and hundreds of requests right now, they may not be able to communicate with you as much as they'd like. but I always talk to teams about setting clear expectations with constituents. So saying, hey, I'm going to reach out to you within the next month. If you don't hear in the next month, call me back. Like that kind of transparency and that kind of expectations management is a sign that that office cares. Another thing too that we've really watched in the last few years is how some officers are investing in kind of activities that are around casework. So besides just doing the casework passively, taking in, working those cases when they come in, going out into the community, hosting mobile office hours, piggybacking on other elected officials events just to introduce that casework team to the community and say, hey, we care about this, we prioritize this work. We're going to make it as easy as possible for you to come to us and bring us any issues that we might be able to work on. And then again, kind of sign of a well-run, really close knit together office also is how much are you seeing that member talk about casework? When they are making statements about policy, are they, grounding those in stories from their district? Are they really clearly, working with their communications team to issue public service announcements on things that they're seeing in their casework? Hey, tax filing date is this day, or hey, we're hearing passport offices are overwhelmed. You might want to apply early if you're thinking about renewing your passport. That kind of thing that really shows how much an office values what it's hearing from its constituent services team. It really tries to knit that service element into everything else that it does.
Yeah, one thing that I've appreciated since leaving Washington, D.C. and having federal representation again is getting communications from my members of Congress. I get little mailers. I see something in the local, we still have a local newspaper, comes out every 3 weeks, but hey, it's something. And they say like, these are the services that we've been able to do on your behalf. And it's just nice to know that, yeah, that kind of chain of communication is super helpful. But sometimes with communication, the people have like misperceptions, right? Or they'll spread, like I see this also happening, like people will spread rumors or whatnot in our local Facebook group for my community. What are some misperceptions? What are some things that some folks, or maybe you've seen like media stories get wrong about casework that, if we could correct the record, we would?
Oh, definitely. Biggest misconception that I see about casework is the connection between casework and the campaign side. So to be really, really crystal clear here, casework is an official side activity. It is in no way connected to the campaign. And actually, we're talking about the ethics restrictions and the legal restrictions on members for what they can and can't do in casework. The giant, clear, bright line is that members cannot privilege people because they have donated to their campaign in casework. So we'll see this sometimes in some of the higher profile stories about corruption cases for members of Congress. This was driving me nuts in some of the Menendez trial stuff recently, where former Senator Menendez himself was saying, this wasn't corruption, this was just constituent services. No, that's not constituent services. That is something else. Again, donations in one bucket, one set of staff, casework in another bucket, different set of staff, firewall between them is the one thing I really, really, really wish everyone understood about casework.
All right, well, we'll make it happen, Ann. Is there
there.
anything, before I turn to audience Q&A, I see we do have a question. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you wanted to have a chance to share?
Yeah, a couple of things, and I'm sure we'll get into some of these in the Q&A. One thing we talked about data a little bit, so I did just want to flag for folks something that's really exciting that we're watching in the House side for data on casework right now, which is the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress a few years ago issued a recommendation that the House should develop a national anonymized casework data aggregator. And that's actually becoming a reality right now. So the House Digital Services team is working on pulling together a tool that will pull anonymized top-line casework data from member offices across the country, so that we will actually have that as a tool within the House that says, hey, that lets us see a heat map of the country and what's going on. So it'll help us kind of really be that data-driven canary in the coal mine and say, hey, there's a 10% spike in VA cases in the Northeast. So then that's a flag to those members, a flag to that committee to say, what's going on here? It's also really helpful for new offices. One of the struggles for new offices is understanding how much casework to expect. And there's some kind of important staff allocation decisions that come with that. Do I want to hire 2 VA caseworkers or 2 immigration caseworkers? That's kind of a really important question about training and hiring that offices really don't necessarily have that information as they're just getting set up. So this dashboard will really not only help on oversight, but also on helping members do a better job of managing casework with the information they need to make informed decisions. And then I'm sure we're going to get into this too, but one thing I do want to call out right now, especially, is that one place where caseworkers are super effective, it's one of the most difficult, but the most important places where casework happens is in disasters. So we had a report earlier this year last year now, on how casework offices handle natural disasters, and also, and I think this is maybe sequituring into the question we have, government shutdowns, which are their own type of man-made crisis that we see in casework.
Perfect segue to audience Q&A, and also our patient audience. Thank you so much. Please do use the Q&A function, and we will share your questions and answer them live. But before we do that, Anne just mentioned the disaster report. That's at popvox.org/disaster. So easy to find. So let's go to the Q&A, and we have a question from Woody Campbell. Are the agency liaisons considered essential staff during government shutdowns?
Oh, this is such a good question. Probably has a much more complicated answer than what he was hoping for. But, so the answer is it really depends on the agency. And it depends on the agency because, and this is something that we're actually working on a big project on this at POPVOX Foundation right now, every agency responds to congressional inquiries differently. So for some agencies, that response is centralized in the DC office. For other agencies, it's handled at the regional level. It's even handled at a local level. So Social Security is a great example. USPS is another great example of where those members are probably not going to a DC office. They're calling a local field office. They're calling the local post office to say, hey, I've heard this inquiry from a constituent. What's going on? Which means that as agencies are designating people essential or non-essential, again, that's really going to vary by the agency, and that is really going to impact how are members of Congress able to get answers for their constituents, especially these really urgent situations. So it depends on the shutdown, depends on whether it's a full or partial shutdown, how many agencies are shut down, and then it depends on how that agency designates staff. And let me take a moment to get on my soapbox here and just say the one thing that always surprises me is Congress has never issued guidance on how agencies are supposed to respond to constituent services inquiries. There's been one law in the past few years. It was the Cases Act in 2019 that only handled how agencies are supposed to take Privacy Act release forms. Other than that, I was talking to a former liaison yesterday who just kind of stopped suddenly in the middle of a conversation and said, there's no law mandating that we have an Office of Legislative Affairs. It's just a norm. So one thing we're hearing from offices right now is there are some issues with liaisons being fired, being riffed, being reassigned. And Congress really hasn't ever taken action to say, hey, agencies, when we send you a constituent service inquiry, this is who we expect to answer it. This is our standards for response. This is our timeline standards for response. And here are penalties if we don't do that. So it's all a little bit of a gentleman's agreement right now.
And hopefully we'll still remember how to be gentle. Thank you for that, Anne. And thank you. We have another question. What is the best way to monitor whether requests to members of Congress for casework help have it increased since Trump took office, as constituents face roadblocks with fewer workers in agencies like VA and Social Security Administration? Great question.
Ooh, such a good question. Yeah. And the answer, until we have that casework data aggregator that I just talked about, the answer is really just building up a relationship with your local congressional office staff. I do find offices are more interested in kind of sharing some of these casework stories, talking a little bit about the data, about what we're seeing. But that takes a little bit of trust. I mean, keep in mind, this is sensitive information that constituents are sharing with their members. You get cases about medical records, about criminal history, your tax stuff, your immigration status. So offices are necessarily a little bit hesitant about can be a bit hesitant about talking to journalists about just what are they seeing. But again, building up that relationship, and I think asking that question directly, and kind of keeping that as an area of inquiry when talking to offices. What are your casework requests doing? Where are you seeing them right now? Is always something that's valid and is worth asking.
Yes, I would have made the little heart emojis flood the screen, but trying to be a bit more professional, but I totally see that. Thank you for those questions. If folks have any others, we're Happy to answer them. In the meantime, just want to thank folks for joining us, whether you're here live or you're watching the recap video. Really appreciate your interest in the work that congressional staff do for the good of the country, for the good of helping the public out. I mean, that's what casework is all about. And I just wanted to let you know that we have the journalist guide is right there at popvox.org. Go to popvox.org/casework. You'll find all kinds of resources related to congressional casework. We have manuals, we have other webinar training videos, popvox.org/casework. And also don't forget to subscribe. Anne's brand new Substack started earlier this year, I want to say. It's voice/mail. So it's voicemailgov.substack.com. And today, Anne has a new post going out about MIC Congress, or like franchise events and constituent outreach. I love how you have a combination of deep dive interviews with political scientists and experts in the field, as well as just really well-researched analyses of the current state of constituent and civic engagement. And I was talking about, oh yeah, the MIC Congress, franchise events, and just all of your writing at voicemail. We will have another Ask Me Anything type training coming up in later this spring, specifically for journalists, and how Congress is using AI themselves, and also because a lot of folks I talk to, like, so how are you using it? I'm like, I'm not really using it. Like, would you like to learn how to use it? Maybe learn how congressional staff are allowed to use it, and maybe have that be an entry point for you. So we'll be doing that, like I said, later this spring. And also, if there's other topics that are of interest to you, please don't be shy. We are here for public service. So I'm Gab, G-A-B, at popvox.org. If you've got questions about casework, please feel free to reach out to Anne, A-N-N-E, at popvox.org. And I'll see if we've got the question. No open questions. Yeah. Like I said, get in touch. Don't be shy. When it comes to helping reporters tell your stories about casework, I've often gotten the question, can you help us get in touch with caseworkers? And the answer is yes, we can help you. Know that most congressional staff are not going to talk on the record. It's not about them. They're, like Anne said, strictly nonpartisan. Don't even want to know who you voted for. If you voted, like, we're just here to help.
Not technically nonpartisan. They do work for partisan offices, even if casework itself tends to be a more nonpartisan activity.
Thank you. Thank you. You're the expert. But we are able to sometimes find folks who are able to at least talk on background, sometimes talk on the record too. So I just don't want to overpromise in that, but that is something that has been developing more and more. And so we are happy to help make those connections. And anything else I've left out, Anne?
Yeah, and to put a finer point on that and maybe talk a little bit about the work that we do for caseworkers, just for context, as is helpful. So as Gab mentioned, I'm a former constituent services director, and then for the last several years, our team has run our Casework Navigator program. That's the stuff up there at popvox.org/casework. Excuse me, I said I'm just getting over a cold. So the work that we do for Casework Navigator is really intended to support and elevate casework. As we said, it's really strange to me that casework is not very well known, even on the Hill. It's not a super studied area of focus. There's no academic work on it. There's an increasing amount of wonderful journalism covering it at local level, at DC national papers and outlets. But on the whole, it is still kind of this little black box of what Congress does. So part of what we try to do is just elevate the role of casework, talk to people about what casework does, about the really deep expertise that caseworkers develop and how agencies work, how they're put together, how they function, how constituents experience the federal government, where those pain points, those really kind of areas of administrative burden, of, as we said, conflicting and confusing agency overlaps happen. So that program is a newsletter that I send out to caseworkers that flags agency updates that are going to show up in their caseloads. That is our webinar series where we bring in speakers to talk to caseworkers. And it is our set of resources for caseworkers, manual templates, guidance, observations, and then it's our research work. So as Gab flagged, we've done a few reports in the last few years, kind of really diving deep into some casework issues. So we've covered the need for better casework data. As we said, that was some of the groundwork around that recommendation from the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress to create the data aggregator that's in progress. We did a big project last year on how congressional offices handled that Afghanistan withdrawal. So that's popvox.org/Afghanistan. If you're interested in taking a look, that really kind of raised a lot of the big issues that we recommend that Congress change to better support, that Congress institute to better support caseworkers. We did cover disasters, so we convened a roundtable of staff who'd recently handled tornadoes, floods, Hurricanes Helene and Milton in the last year, and talked to them about, hey, how did this work for you? What would have helped from the agency side to help you serve your constituents better? What would have been helpful from the congressional side to help you to help those staff just handle that incident also? So that's the kind of big picture research that we do around casework. As I said, we're continuing to kind of stay alive to what's happening for congressional offices. Just how are they getting those constituent inquiries related to DOJ activities, related to Trump administration work to resize the federal government right now. And then we are really focusing on those agency liaisons, are those liaisons able to support congressional inquiries? What's the infrastructure for really that interbranch contact between Congress and the agencies when we're talking about constituent services inquiries? There was also further reading, if folks are interested. There was a wonderful Administrative Conference of the United States report late last year by Sean Kelly on just looking at how does that contact work? What does that agency liaison structure look like? Where are the problems? Where are the pain points? And some recommendations there that we've supported as well. So this is kind of a multi-pronged approach for us for POPVOX Foundation, where we're trying to support caseworkers, elevate casework, and then do that research into, hey, what are the big picture things? What are we learning here? So I hope all of that is helpful. And as Gab said, if folks have questions about any of the above, I am always happy to talk on the record, on background as helpful, just to be a resource however I can to understand how casework works.
Thank you, Anne, and thanks for doing this today as you're getting over a cold. Your voice held out. Want to thank the folks who joined us live, folks who are watching a video replay. We will share this soon, probably tomorrow. So please feel free to share it within your newsrooms, share it with your colleagues, and stay tuned for more. I hope you all have a great day. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, everyone.